really lucky to have her here this week. Hopefully you guys had meetings with her this week. I did. It was insightful, and I felt truly privileged to be able to meet with her. I'm just going to give you guys a couple little blurbs, and then I'm going to let Anna do her thing. For those of you that don't know, Anna received her PhD from Yale University in 1982 and her BA from Harvard in 1975. She's probably most widely known for her revisionist readings on minimalism. She's done numerous essays. Probably more importantly is some of her recent going-ons. She at the 2015 CAA convention, she was awarded the prize for the best art journal essay for a piece called Grave Matters: Positioning Carl Andre at Career's End. Also, coming up, let me see if I get this right, for the Women's Art Journal this spring, she's doing a project. It's going to be, it's called Frankenthaler's Fortunes, which looks at the impact of class privilege on the artist reception. Today her lecture is called High Tide, Fluidity in Women's Art Practice. Please help me welcome Anna Chave.
I feel like I know a lot of you already since I've been in a lot of studios. This is, I know, an audience, a lot of artists, less of art historians, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a kind of preliminary description of what this project is. Well, I think that the successes of feminism often get forgotten, in part because they get naturalized. And that's all the more true with proto-feminist initiatives, which can go unrecognized altogether because they often have a kind of stealthy aspect to them. Now, the long 60s decade, which is where I'm basically starting, is a favored focus of art historians and a lot of other people nowadays. But the underground role that feminism had in the art world in that period remains underestimated, in my view, because it seemed on the surface like a really futile moment, a hopeless moment for feminism, and yet it turns out to be instead, or this is what I'm going to argue here, to be a moment of really major possibility. So this paper, this lecture, is tracing a kind of before and after to a time when attaching one's artwork to a feminist agenda became to a degree feasible. You know, for up until the 70s, it was basically career suicide. No one in their right mind would claim to be doing feminist work, and in the 70s that changes. So I'm going to focus here on some female artists whose importance is by now widely acknowledged. I'm not out to recover reputations. That's something that feminist art historians often do, but what I'm out to recover instead is a kind of shared feminist undercurrent to these various artists' diverse endeavors. And that word current is key here because what I'm tracing more specifically is a shared interest in fluidity. And to introduce that topic for me, I'll defer to, it's always better to have Virginia Woolf speak than to speak oneself. So I'm going to start with a crucial first wave feminist. That's Woolf on the right, of course, and just what I'm showing you on the left is a painting by her sister, who was an artist, Vanessa Bell. Okay, while standing stymied before a blank canvas, Lily Briscoe, a character in To the Lighthouse, murmurs to herself, "Can't paint, can't write." Struggling to overcome that internalized dismissive male voice, she, quote, anxiously considers what her plan of attack should be. Then suddenly, as Woolf pictured it, as if some juice necessary for the lubrication of her faculties were spontaneously squirted, she began precariously dipping among the blues and umbers, moving her brush hither and thither as if it had fallen in with some rhythm which was dictated to her. A rhythm strong enough to bear her along on its current. I'm excerpting a bit here. Certainly she was losing consciousness about her things, and as she lost consciousness, her mind kept throwing up from its depths scenes and names and sayings and memories and ideas, like a fountain spurting over that glaring, hideously difficult white space. End quote. This specter of a semi-conscious, hapless woman swept away by a creative current could be said to conjure almost a scenario of self-obliteration, possibly even a foreshadowing of Woolf's own act of suicide by drowning. But once Briscoe's mind starts spewing its juices, she succeeds in attacking the canvas that had intimidated her. She finds her way by losing herself, in other words, losing herself in an uncontrollable gush of fluid. That paradoxical scenario, conjured by Woolf in 1927, in a way anticipates the later emergence of a nexus of female artists whose unruly releases of fluids not only gained them new agency as artists, but also upended an almost monolithically male contemporary art field. Or that's what I'm going to try to suggest here. Historically, the bias that creative capacity was properly the domain of autogenous male creators or bachelor machines is one that lingered for centuries. Even in the mid-20th century, a critic could describe, say, Jackson Pollock as, quote, casting paint like seed onto the canvas spread at his feet while executing the real thing, painting composed of manly ejaculatory splat. Spurting creative juices were a trope for potency then, and not always a mere trope. Marcel Duchamp, Vito Acconci, and Anselm Kieper each deployed their actual semen in their art, as did Andres Serrano in his 1980s Ejaculate and Trajectory series. But unlike the involuntary flow that overtook the fictional Briscoe, the male artist's creative flow was generally seen as subject to a, however hard-won, degree of control or mastery. Thus, Clement Greenberg could salute, for instance, David Smith for imparting in his sculpture, quote, the sense of a checked flow, whose further unactualized abundance and power reverberate through that which is actualized. For that matter, some critics insinuated that Pollock's radical process strayed into a feminized realm of uncontrol or chaos, and I've suggested elsewhere that Pollock occupies discursively a kind of transsexuating role as an artist. So too, in a way, does Briscoe, though, for her juices have an ejaculatory aspect. And Woolf's image of a vital, spurting female fluids would in a way be resumed by Sylvia Plath, who warned in a 1963 poem, "The blood jet is poetry. There is no stopping it." In actuality, menstrual blood tends less to jet than to ooze or leak, as do those other fluids that issue only from a biologically female body, namely breast milk and vaginal mucus. You didn't know I was going to get so graphic. Broadly speaking, leakage betokens structural deficiency or failure. It followed for some feminists that the ignominious specter of women's helplessly seeping, staining bodies might be held to account for their longtime social subordination. In Marilyn French's 1978 novel, The Women's Room, for instance, a female student ruminates to her peers that they say to let women enter med school or Harvard or whatever means lowering their standards. But you know as well as I that women do better than men in high school grades. So when they talk about standards, it's a euphemism. The real reason is sanitary. You let women through the front doors and what will they do? Splat, splat. A big cloud of menstrual blood right on the threshold. End quote. Besides the long-standing association in the West of the female body with a state of lack, then, there is also an indelible association with the hapless leakage of gooey fluid, a primal, possibly fecund slime that may threaten entrapment. Of the traditional studio art media, paint perhaps answers best to the description of a gooey fluid. Historically, female artists have managed to make names for themselves as painters only in rare cases. But as of the early 1960s, the very ongoing viability of painting as a medium was for a time improbably credited to a woman, namely Helen Frankenthaler, by the leading critic of the day, namely Clement Greenberg, who believed he discerned in her experiments in staining on prime canvas unfurled over the floor the authentic legacy of Pollock. Through paintings with sometimes resonant titles such as Before the Caves and Flood of 1967, Frankenthaler became the first woman credited with founding a visual art movement of some consequence, namely stain painting. Critical responses to her work could betray misogynist overtones, however, as when Eugene Goosen charged Frankenthaler with making over Pollock's, quote, masculine, almost hard-edged linear splashes of paint into a distinctly feminine, broad, bleeding-edge stain on raw linen. Charged her, in effect, with having stained the sheets, as Lisa Salzman once noted. By contrast, that is, with the apparently more controlled essays of her male counterparts, Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan. Greenberg aside, Pollock's freely poured so-called all-over paintings implied to many that the once dominant medium of the modern Western visual regime, painting, was all over, kaput. Gutai artists, such as Shozo Shimamoto and Kazuo Shiraga, Happenings founder Alan Capro, and others foresaw Pollock's legacy unfolding instead in the arena of performance, a newly reclaimed, hence laxly policed avant-garde realm that female practitioners soon managed to infiltrate. Fluxus artist Shigeko Kubata, for one, enacted a tacit retort to Pollock's putatively ejaculatory practice in her 1965 vagina painting. With a paintbrush attached to her underpants, Kubata squatted over a bucket of red paint and then waddled over an expanse of white paper, covering it with an erratic pseudo-menstrual calligraphy that implicitly spelled out the comparatively abject status of an artist saddled with a vagina. For want of any viable feminist art discourse at that time, Kubata's pointed action reportedly just startled and dismayed her New York audience. Much later, Amelia Jones could salute her for having, quote, activated the site of the vagina as the originary point of the meaningful painterly gesture. But I'd say that Kubata's action instead mocked or vacated the painterly gesture, in part by yielding only a disposable object. This wasn't something that was supposed to be kept. And that sort of corroborates the social coding of menstruation as an instance of failed production. Demonstrably no match, that is, for the gloriously seminal act of painting. Accepting Kubata, the prospect of an intently menstrual art remained inconceivable in the 60s, though the liminality of the menstrual did then haunt some of adventurous women's dreams. Eva Hesse recorded a dream on October 17, 1966. She called it a potent dream, set in the lavatory at New York's Museum of Modern Art. Tough getting a photograph of a lavatory at the Museum of Modern Art in that era from the inside, so you're going to have to make do with the outside. Hesse, whose own copious and agonizing periods would incidentally force her to have surgery, dreamed that, quote, there was a huge line to the bathroom, men and women together. The bathroom floor was very dirty, Kotex used, but it looked like wet Louise Bourgeois, wax-like. Against this repulsive backdrop, Hesse imagined physically attacking a woman who had lately become in actuality the lover of her estranged husband, the sculptor Tom Doyle. A paragon of femininity, quote, Jane was soft, kind, sweet, and helpless, Hesse explained. I didn't really hate her. I hated not being her, so I beat her up. In 1966, the so-called ladies' rooms were practically the only spaces MoMA allotted to women, whose artwork was all but invisible in its galleries. But in Hesse's dream, men and women both occupied a sleek modernist bathroom incongruously festooned with bloody detritus reminiscent of bourgeois art. Bourgeois was a rare, sometime exception to MoMA's neglect of female artists, likely thanks in part to her art historian husband Robert Goldwater's friendship with MoMA power broker Alfred Barr. But the bourgeois who enjoyed that entree was that of the 1950s, whose neo-surrealist wooden figures reciprocated then dominant tropes of sculptural practice, such as by David Smith, that's Smith on the upper right, and the rest of bourgeois. The bourgeois who inspired the abject fantasy animating Hesse's Sleep, by contrast, emerged abruptly in the early 1960s, when her art underwent a proverbial sea change, from rigid to fluid materials, from upright verticality to, in her words, spiral forms and structures that open up within an enveloping skin to reveal internal rhythms, and from totems suggesting an entire personage to fetish-like objects, evoking anatomical fragments or natural artifacts. Whereas rigidity had once seemed essential, Bourgeois then said, today it seems futile and has vanished. But what made rigidity futile or fluidity necessary at this juncture? And not, as it happens, to Bourgeois alone. The 60s saw the emergence of what Lucy Lepard called soft and apparently soft sculpture, and what Robert Morris called anti-form in successive exhibitions in 1968. Though Klaus Oldenburg is generally credited with inventing soft sculpture, it now seems that Yayoi Kusama anticipated him, while Bourgeois and Hesse both preceded Morris in exploring anti-form. That's Morris on the right and Bourgeois and Hesse in the middle there. As former or sometime painters, these three women transitioned in the mid-60s to three-dimensional practices that, however, attacked established procedures of the sculptural. Now, freedom to move among media is nowadays completely assumed by artists, but the 60s remained in the lingering grip of a Greenbergian model, insistent on distinct medium categories, within which success was effectively debarred to women. In the case of painting, Frankenthaler was the proverbial exception that proves the rule, and she was not incidentally Greenberg's erstwhile girlfriend. The medium of, I mean, that's not to say there wasn't importance to her work, right? But that you needed something else to sort of get yourself seen in this era. The medium of sculpture was inaccessible to women, besides, due to their general ignorance of non-domestic tools and the hazing they faced in hardware stores and the like. Girls were basically purposely socialized to be technically incompetent, in other words. I mean, public school systems, the girls had home economics, the boys had shop, right? And they didn't let girls anywhere near tools. So you were just lucky if you were a tomboy and you had a father who was willing to show you how to use this stuff. And then, you know, it wasn't like nowadays you can go into Home Depot and they're so nice to you and they tell you exactly like where everything is and how to use it. It wasn't like that. Like it was like women were almost not allowed in hardware stores in the middle days. But bourgeois and others, they exploited this disadvantage in a way by deploying softer viscous materials in ways that enunciate their fluidity and so animate a state of haplessness. As for bourgeois, she turned in the 60s to plaster and resin and used latex innovatively. She's a real pioneer in using latex as a sculptural medium in itself, not just as an aid to casting. The materials suited a vision provoked, in her words, by a revealed and fleeting vision of nature, one crystallized by a visit to the Lascaux caves, that's what you're seeing in the upper left there, whose enveloping negative form, this is her description, was produced by the torrent of water that has left its waves upon the ceiling, end quote. An age-old analog for the female body, the cave or lair, L-A-I-R, that's a title of a lot of bourgeois' work from this period, factored as one among other suggested images that bourgeois conjured with impunity in the 60s, owing to then stringent formalist prohibitions against ascribing content to abstract art. By the late 60s, bourgeois' provocative forms had elicited some comment, however. You may have seen, for instance, things she did that really looked like a penis and a cross between a penis and a baby, and believe it or not, at the time, no one would dare to say that it looked like a penis, because it was just like, well, it's a long, elegant form, and it was like, you really couldn't call a penis, and not just because it's something sexual. By the late 60s, she had to own up that these things, as she put it, they evinced a language understood by a few. And she cited the oozing out of milk, mother, water, spring and Mother Earth, saliva in snails, lava in volcano. Content, she added, is a concern with the human body, what it needs, wants, and feels, its functions. All these states of being, perceiving, and doing are expressed by processes that are familiar to us and that have to do with the treatment of materials, pouring, flowing, dripping, oozing out, setting, hardening, coagulating, thawing, expanding, contracting. End quote. Captivated by the specter of the body turned inside out, a maternal body more specifically, bourgeois at times permitted her fluid materials to portray an endemic formlessness. Flirting with what Bataille termed the inform didn't necessarily mean asserting non-forms, and this is something George D. Huberman says, but rather engaging in a labor of forms equivalent to the labor of giving birth. And what art historian Mignon Nixon calls the attack on form, manifest in some of Bourgeois' more extreme works, would finally amount to nothing less than a, quote, aggressive rethinking of what sculpture might be. Bourgeois' radical turn was fresh in Hesse's mind at the time she had this dream in 1966, because both artists had then recently participated in a gallery group show together. It was the first show that Lucy Lepard curated. That's what Hesse showed. And this is the same sculpture seen in black and white. You know, the latex turns color, so it's now, that's like a very dark, it wouldn't have been dark originally, so I'm showing it to black and white image as well. Different angle too. Just months after the Jewish Museum's primary structure show signaled the coalescence of a minimalist movement, Lepard's eccentric abstraction show seemed to spell already a superseding of that movement. The antithesis of minimalism's clear, solid, elegant, ostensibly rational geometric forms, Bourgeois' inchoate, globbed latex portrait, the work here on the right, which was in the show, might by itself explain Hesse's dream of heaped wads of used sanitary napkins. And there were besides some, quote, flexible fluid latex molds with indirectly erotic or scatological allusions, as Lepard called them. A work such as Portrait may invite age-old misogynist associations of women with repulsive, viscous fluidity. But Bourgeois arguably anticipated the reclaiming of such associations by French feminist thinkers. In 1974, the dissident Lacanian Lucie Irigaray would argue that, in contrast to what she deemed the long-standing complicity between male rationality and solids, female expression represented something subversely other. Quote, that woman thing speaks fluid. It is continuous, compressible, dilatable, viscous, conductible, diffusible, unending, resistant to the countable, changeable in volume or in force, easily traversed by flow, and unstable. Bourgeois' more radical 60s objects not only countered the dominant modalities of the period, meaning minimalism and pop, but they, quote, ignored almost everything conventionally expected of sculpture, as Lepard said at the time, such as mass or a decorative silhouette. Now, the decorative was above all what was expected of female artists at this juncture, inasmuch as you can say anything was expected of them at all. Women want to please. Women make pleasing art, Linda Benglis stated in 1974. And art must be beautiful, artist must be beautiful, Marina Abramovich chanted in a video the following year. Bourgeois was likewise steeped in such commonplaces. That's her on the left. On this score, some of her and Hesse's diary entries are all but interchangeable, as when the elder woman wrote in 1966, for instance, I want to be pretty, nice, popular, have friends for dinner, be successful as a sculptor, but above everything else, be liked. But the specter of the acquiescent, decorative, and domestic woman, say the Jane of Hesse's dream, would prove at once an elusive ideal and a chronic rebuke to Bourgeois and Hesse, who were both known in the 60s for the anti-decorative, non-compliant work that they often formed from their pliant materials. For her part, Hesse, who once termed the decorative the only art sin, would come to distrust her own work when it impressed her as too right. "I'd like to do a little more wrong at this point," she confided in 1970, as she was reckoning at once with her mortality and her legacy. "I don't want to keep any rules." It's noteworthy that Hesse voiced this aim to, quote, change the rules, specifically while discussing her use of fluid materials. "If the material is liquid," she affirmed, "I can control it, but I don't really want to change it." She discovered in 1967 her affinity for latex and fiberglass, materials that she proceeded to use in their fluid state, pouring and brushing them, more than anyone else before her, despite their known toxicity and their susceptibility to deterioration. She angsted over that, but she decided she had to have it, basically. Of the idiosyncratic yet luminescent objects that resulted, Hesse said, "A lot of my sculpture could be called paintings, and a lot of it could be called nothing. A thing or an object or any new word you want to give it, they aren't traditional." This non-work, as Hesse also termed it, quickly proved central to the artistic dialogue and curatorial constructions of the late 60s in the estimation of many observers then and since. It followed that Hesse managed to become a legitimate presence at the MoMA, which in 1969 acquired Repetition 19-3, a group of deformed cylinders, loosely reminiscent of at once male and female genitalia, as well as, more so, of misshapen buckets, such as might have held her fluid materials. Plus, in a radical refusal of the artist's tacit imperative to dictate its form, the elongated buckets were meant to be randomly arranged. Despite the irregularity prompted by her fluid materials, a minimalist affinity for geometry haunted much of Hesse's late 60s work. Thus, one reviewer saw in her art in 1968 a demoralized geometry, just barely rescued from complete dissolution. Hesse soon suspended that rescue. At her life's close, with the prospect looming of exposure in Life magazine, that's basically as big as it got in those days in terms of like mass market exposure. It was a big moment when Pollock got into Life magazine, for instance. So she knows this is coming, and with this in mind, she gets a new work. She's about to die, and she knows that too. But she gets a new work sufficiently underway to represent herself in that conspicuous forum. In her notebook, she called for, quote, hung irregularly tying knots as connections, really letting it go as it will. And in January 1970, she supervised a friend who provided her with cable cord of all sizes, knotted the cord randomly, dumped it in rubber, and strung it up. To Life's reporter, Hesse explained, when the piece is completed, its order could be chaos. Chaos can be structured as non-chaos. That we know from Jackson Pollock. Playfully animating the chaos she sought, Hesse posed peering out predatorily from her tangled, deformed web, which could be, quote, open, closed, spread, condensed, and thus comprised what she called non-forms, non-shapes, non-plan. Nowadays, it's agreed that, as Bryony Fair put it, what Hesse's late work stands for in terms of the reconfiguration of the object is fantastically important for subsequent generations of artists, end quote. That fluidity was key to this reconfiguration was already evident in Hesse's time. In an instance of gender parody, rare for 1970, she and Benglis were featured alongside Richard Serra, flinging lead, and Richard Van Buren, he's since sort of dropped out of the picture. He was dripping pigmented resin in Life magazine's feature, which was called Fling, Dribble, and Dip, and which was basically about positioning Pollock as the shared forefather of this new development. Whereas fluid materials were a mainstay to Hesse and Benglis, however, such was not the case for Serra. Like a lot of men were also experimenting with fluid materials, but they didn't get quite as hooked on them as the women did in this film. Like Hesse, who inspired her to use latex, actually, Benglis, who you're looking at here, and she actually headlined the Life feature, she talked of letting her material take its own form, upping the ante on Pollock's notorious resort to the accident by pigmenting the latex with garish day-glow colors. The avant-garde was a very chromophobic place at that time. It's mostly been a chromophobic place, but it was especially at that time. At a time when painters were increasingly viewed as having become painted into a proverbial corner, Benglis would literally paint her way out of a corner with pigments that were highly viscous and hence incipiently, if unconventionally, sculptural. She amplified that gesture by leaving her copious pigments puddled inertly on the floor in a flamboyantly incontinent retort to Carl Andre's self-contained metal planes. But if the specter of the accident presides over Benglis's outsized spills, so arguably does that of the cleanup. For the part she played for Life's photographer has been seen as a kind of pop parody of a long-time advertising trope, namely the housewife unaccountably dazzled by her floor care products. The fact that not a single bucket of colored goop was overturned, however, as in Smithson's remotely realized glue pour, where there's just one bucket that's on the upper left, and he didn't overturn it even, but rather a series of such buckets, evinces deliberate mischief, however. And this mischief was committed by one prepared to risk the art sin of which female artists were reflexively suspected. For Benglis's rubbery carpets evinced a loosely decorative aspect, as of outsized marbling. That's what I'm showing you on the lower right there, right? You recognize it from old like book covers and things. The kind and degree of aesthetic calculation here decisively separated her, however, from the female forerunner whose example she sardonically saluted in a work subtitled, Hey, Hey, Frankenthaler. Unlike Frankenthaler, Frankenthaler rebuffed feminist initiatives, basically. She was always like, ooh, keep this as far away from me as possible. Benglis acknowledged in the 70s that she was ambivalent. Women are always ambivalent about feminism, but Benglis, it was easier to be ambivalent about it in the 70s because it was even clunkier in the 70s. Benglis, I shouldn't say always, but it's most women are torn. Benglis acknowledged in the 70s, moreover, that her art was all about female sexuality, about being a woman. And she recently reminisced about how these erotic works suggesting fluids had, quote, scared the hell out of male artists. Willfully occupying the role of the immoderately oozing woman, defined paradoxically by her lack of containment, Benglis flamboyantly leaked her contraband, which was the title of a 1969 work, it's the book on the right, that the Whitney refused to exhibit on account of its flagrant excess. Afterwards, Benglis spilled more volumetric mounds of polyurethane foam on the floor, some of which she then cast in metal, including pedestrian lead and aluminum, as well as venerable bronze. With ebulliently vulgar humor, she titled two of these Come and Modern Art, the one being practically interchangeable with the other. As with Akanchi masturbating under a platform in 1971, we have here, in a sense, Come materialized as modern art. A dramatization, and in Benglis's case also, a crypto-feminist send-up of the legendary Bachelor machine. By pouring polyurethane foam over armatures in subsequent works of this period, Benglis conjured cave-like and wave-like formations that surge uncannily from the wall like a row of explosively liquefying paintings frozen in place. The liquid was an unformed form, as she put it later, and I was looking to it to emerge as a primal form. Despite her material's contemporaneity, critics generally frame these enveloping works in prehistoric or elemental terms. Benglis' then partner, art writer Klaus Curtis, used wordings reminiscent of bourgeois. He invoked body fluids and flow, the pull of the moon, the ebb and flow of tides, menstrual cycles, volcanic eruptions, and a strong female sensuality to describe these category-defying works that, quote, might have been painting or maybe a sculpture or either or both. In some comparably heterodox works from the same time, Hannah Wilkie peeled thin sheets of poured latex off the floor and snapped them together in abstractly labial configurations with suggestive titles such as Rosebud and Centerfold. Works she called very luscious, very beautiful and opening up like gentle waves, like flowers, to express a feeling related to orgasmic ecstasy, end quote. These pink, almost lacy objects flirted with the decorative, as had Benglis's work, and both artists flirted likewise with the camera, extrapolating their practices into the realm of performance. There, however, they ran afoul of prevailing feminist mores, which framed them as complicit. 70s feminism was pretty puritanical. These age-old tropes of the fluidity of the feminine and the femininity of the fluid at once derived from and served to perpetuate what Naomi Shore once termed a repertory of misogyny. Tied by the experience of menstruation to the cycles of the moon, women had long been consigned to the realm of nature as against that of culture. Letting loose material flows from the 60s onward, numerous women effectively vacated that hoary binary by investigating the natural as a cultural endeavor, and so reclaiming an invidious stereotype with a proverbial vengeance. Female corporeality might have insidiously augured, in Elizabeth Gross's words, a formlessness that engulfs all form, or a disorder that threatens all order. But inasmuch as order had historically tacitly spelled patriarchal order, it would at this historical juncture occur to numerous women who seem to have proceeded to embolden one another, that the prospect of formless flows that threaten all order could spell less a calamity than an outright feminist coup. Or, as Irigaray mused in 1981, might there not exist a fluid, some deluge that could shake this social order? Bourgeois, Hesse, Benglis, and Wilkie all seemingly discerned a subversive potential in the insubordinate vamping of the role of the seeping, secreting, all-engulfing woman. And while violating medium boundaries and protocols, these breakthrough figures arguably anticipated the French feminist call for a distinctively fluid form of female expression, that, quote, new insurgent writing that Hélène Cixous poetically imagined as inscribed in the white maternal ink of the mère, or mother sea. In French, they sound the same. By the time Cixous framed this ambition, the pursuit of fluidity was already taking a more programmatic or literal turn in the US, though, on account of so-called second wave feminism. The specter of the elementally feminine would figure importantly, for instance, in Ana Mendieta's artwork from the mid-70s onward. She deployed not latex, but actual blood and water, and she realized her menstruation works in actual cave-like grottos in her native Cuba. Motivated by her own account, by rage over her childhood displacement from Cuba, and a yearning to return to the quote, maternal source, Mendieta made Source in 1975, filming in close-up a large breast with milk spilling from the nipple as a woman's fingers gently squeeze it. A woman is never far from mother, declared Cixous that year. There is always within her at least a little of that good mother's milk. Cixous and Irigaray came under feminist censure in the 1980s, decried as essentialist. But just as, say, Elizabeth Gross would carefully frame as a discursive construction her 1990s description of female corporeality as comprising a mode of seepage, so too did the French women. They were explicit that they were concerned with not some like direct reality, but with cultural inscriptions. Cixous noted that women had always had to function within the discourse of man, even as she urged women to, quote, dislocate this within, to explode it and seize it, taking it in her own mouth, biting that tongue with her very own teeth, to invent for herself a language to get inside of it. Reclaiming fluidity represented a productive interim strategy for Cixous and Irigaray both, in short. Only by defending, symbolizing the value of what has been placed outside the transcendental, as Margaret Whitford once put it, can some redistribution take place. given how central it is to survival, the fluid might seem always already ripe for revaluation. Human beings live in and on flows. They die when streams dry up. I don't have to tell you this in California. Klaus Table said that, as it happens, but we all know it. But some feminists set out to revalue even the tabooed menstrual flow. This is a Schiemann. Historically, menstrual blood has widely been seen as a pollutant. And as anthropologist Mary Douglas framed it in 1966, a polluting person is always in the wrong. The menstrual or premenstrual woman was typically cast as a troublesome being, at times subject to removal from public spheres. You know, in some societies they have the menstrual hut, right, and you can take the woman apart from the rest of society when she's menstruating. It's not that way here, but there are other ways in which such things happen, or happened. In the US through the 70s, extreme euphemism characterized ads for feminine hygiene products, where they were permitted at all. Intent on allaying menstrual terror, Sheila LaVrank de Bretteville essayed in 1971 the common sense tactic of videotaping different demographic groups discussing menstruation. But others were less conciliatory. Valerie Solanas, the deranged founder of the Society for Cutting Up Men, left behind in Andy Warhol's studio a bag with a sanitary napkin after shooting him at point-blank range in 1968. 2 years later, feminist protesters planted used tampons and smashed eggs in the Whitney Museum stairwell. And in 1971, Judy Chicago's red flag photolithograph, that's what you're seeing on the lower right there, of a used tampon being extracted, jarred her West Coast audience, for whom the gory cylinder reportedly suggested the realized threat of the specter of the castrating feminist. That is, people thought it was like a penis being cut off, right? Which sort of freaked Chicago out, and she's had a kind of ambivalent relationship with this image since, is my understanding. In general, the menstrual art that surfaced bicoastally during the 70s, you probably recognize some, if not all of this, Faith Wilding, Chicago, Schiemann. This art tacitly broached a fundamental question then subtending feminist art discourse, namely, what could art look like if it were made by women bent on enunciating rather than muffling or encrypting their subject positions? And mightn't such art bring earth-shaking news? The 70s feminist explicit recourse to biology got derided, however, in the 80s, when a concept of gender as above all socially reproduced took hold. But in 1990, what I'm showing you here, Laurie Anderson mischievously resumed the menstrual initiative. By this time, student studies were linking premenstrual and menstrual phases to a sexual aggressiveness that supposedly prompts not just dread, but also attraction in men. Anderson's hypnotic song and video set out to entice her male listener by promising that he would look, quote, really good standing beside her beautiful red dress, as the work is called. At the same time, though, she taunted, I'm on a roll, I'm on a wild ride, because the moon is full, and look out, baby, I'm at high tide. It's better when she does it. To Anderson, high tide spelled high time, then, as she proceeded to skewer an age-old excuse for barring women from the corridors of power. They say women shouldn't be the president, because we go crazy from time to time. Well, push my button, baby, here I come. Backed up by a chorus of black and white, young and old, female and transgender singers, the last slyly signaling that biology alone need not determine sexual identity, the androgynously garbed white performer interrupts her own song to blurt out, okay, hold it. You know, for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 63 cents. Now, 50 years ago, that was 62 cents. So with that kind of luck, it'll be the year 3,888 before we make a buck. A quarter century later, with an albeit menopausal female president conceivably on the horizon, The gender pay gap is projected to take just 75 years to close. What explains the lingering inequity, however, is widely said to be the costs attaching to maternity. Motherhood means deviating from workforce standards predicated on masculine models, which have all along tacitly assumed unremunerated female carriers of and caretakers for employee offspring. Nowadays, it can count as enlightened when, for instance, I just read this recently in the New York Times, Silicon Valley has elected to finance the freezing of eggs by female employees, the better to retrofit their biology to a masculine career model. So you don't have to have your baby like when you're really, hot to go in your career. You can like put that off till you're, 50, 60 when you're kind of not so valuable to what you do. It doesn't really work out that way, as a lot of women have found out. But in part because U.S. feminists have long privileged an egalitarian model of progress, which doesn't countenance the inconvenient facts of maternity. Motherhood by now imposes about twice the earning penalty in this country as in other industrialized nations, where maternal or parental leave and subsidized childcare are more the norm. Since the 70s, more and more women who have access to reproductive services, and that's getting to be a tougher and tougher ask lately, have elected to avoid maternity, intent in part on avoiding poverty. English-speaking feminists have long been wary of affirming the corporeality of women, Gross once noted. And this evasion has had consequences, not only with, there were reasons for it, but it's had consequences. Not only with respect to the impact of motherhood, but also to issues of sexual exploitation. With regard to such matters, women, meaning by which I mean the female identified generally, continue to function within the discourse, and not the discourse alone, of man. Now, the prospect that some brave woman wielding white ink might explode that within, as Sixsoup has postulated, or precipitate some deluge that might shake this social order, as Irigaray mused, may sound preposterous and archaic today. But I am pointing out that certain women deploying fluid in a kind of sub rosa lineage of our practice actually did shake the cultural order, helping to dissolve age-old protocols of our practice and broaching new vocabularies of art making. Rather than struggle for equal access to the art world mainstream, these women instead effectively redirected that stream. They did so, and they're given credit for it now, but not by this kind of narrative that I'm offering you. They did so by irrigating and investigating the properties of the stream so as to practice art, however tacitly, as women. In taking flagrant ownership of the most elemental and tainted attributes of their gender, owing the anti-seductiveness of what it is to ooze, these women generally declined, moreover, to wallow in the Bataillean abject, invoking instead pleasure or a kind of absurd humor. Now that's my first conclusion, but knowing this is a contemporary audience of contemporary artists mainly, I wanted to bring it a little into the present moment. So as a postscript, I wanted to point out that this pleasure or humor is also animating some of the more visible present-day feminist forays into the fluid, namely those of the people I thought I'd bring on board here, on stage here, are people out of Rist and Mika Rottenberg. It's Rist you're looking at here. Rist launched her sanguine reprise of the menstrual venture in the 90s, asserting that a positive conception of blood as a life force can only be transferred to menstruation by bringing it out in the open. That's almost a kind of 70s speech there. In her 2008 Pour Your Body Out, that's what you're looking at here, at MoMA, a looped 16-minute video culminates with a woman's body rising from a pool as blood trickles inexplicably between her nubile breasts and spills from her white underpants, turning at once the water and the museum's gigantic atrium into a virtual menstrual swimming pool. I snagged all these images off the internet, and I had to go through like hours and hours of footage to like find one where I could get the underpants. I don't know whether that's a coincidence, but I started to feel like it was like a plot. So she makes this kind of vast menstrual swimming pool in the Pour Your Body Out evinces wrist bent towards 60s psychedelia, and she also sees her work as resuming 60s ambitions to put art into regular life, as she put it, inviting viewer involvement by dispelling institutional constraints. You can see there was this kind of round couch in the middle of the atrium. Parents started coming with their toddlers and parking them in the middle of the circle, and people were sort of rolling around on the couch, and the kind of decorum that you sort of assume will be people's behavior in museums was a little bit lost in this, which is what she was looking for. Actually, she even had like a yoga class held in there, so she was trying to work it in different ways. Rist's desire to provide women a, quote, healthy, playful sensibility in relation to their body may explain why she featured only a female body, as also in her footage of a nude young woman and a pig grazing, and crawling in a joint embrace of their animality through fields of tulips and apples. The aim of promoting a naturalized, integrated, disinhibited experience of the body in the core viewing space of the MoMA was one that Rist finally meant for all viewers, of course, but female bodies remain preponderantly more vulnerable in the public space, as the artist acknowledged. Quote, "We have so many fears and restrictions," she told a female critic, adding ingenuously, "It would be great if nobody treated us badly, because we could be more spontaneous." The perennial fetishizing of young women's bodies remains intrinsic to how women are treated badly, however, by helping to license less virtual forms of objectification and by erecting unrealistic, hypersexualized, and homogenized standards of female appearance. Further, if aspects of pour out your body invoke a form of corporeality to which men have tended to be averse, namely uncontrollable, excessive, expansive, disruptive, irrational corporeality, in Gross's words, Rist's cavorting, naked, nubile white protagonists nonetheless seem calculated more so to please that usual suspect, the straight white male viewer. In reviewing a sequel to the MoMA work called Pepperminta, the critic Peter Sheldau, for one, could rhapsodize about its visual and musical gorgeousness, while mentioning only in passing a, quote, unfortunate sacrament that the work involved, namely drinking from a chalice of menstrual blood. Said Sheldau tolerantly, "My mind wandered at that point." Some 4 decades after feminists seditiously planted bloody tampons in a museum stairwell, menstrual blood would legitimately flood a venerable museum then, but an oddly blissful, messless menstrual flow, deployed by an emphatically friendly feminist. For Rist didn't aim, as she said, to break, destroy, or even be provocative toward an institution that had historically systematically erased women. Rather, she aspired to melt into it, to effect sedition by way of seduction, a tactic whose tendentiousness has largely ebbed since Wilke and Benglis perceived. Fetishized female bodies likewise heavily populate the art of Rottenberg, who tends to seduce, however, with more eccentrically diverse bodies, such as the self-described large in charge Latina protagonist of the 2005-6 video sculpture, Doe, on the upper left, and with a view, besides, to the numbing labor and economics of inducing seduction, the work entailed in inducing seduction. Various fluids, such as tears or milk and goos, such as latex, animate Rottenberg's opulent work. She actually shows, I didn't find an image of it, but she shows the rubber trees being milked in India, which is, it looks surreal, but it is really how they get the latex. It's like farmed that way. Like Rist, Rottenberg is captivated by cliches about femininity, including, in her words, associations between women, fertility, and the earth, trite ways of thinking, which satisfy a basic desire for resolution and simplicity. For Rottenberg, however, quote, "The fun really starts when I dissect the cliches, turning them inside out and showing them as they really are, creepy and uncanny." Putting an enigmatic spin on a mode of art making by now familiar from, say, the weirdly charged spectacles of Matthew Barney, Rottenberg ponders, quote, what the way out might be from this claustrophobic feeling of being physically trapped inside my body, my sexuality. my gender, end quote. Thus, too, she elaborately inquires what a feminist statement, not to mention what liberation, may consist in the art world today. Okay, thank you. Too much menstrual blood? Yeah.
Thanks for a great lecture. I don't have a formulated question. I had, when you first started talking about flow, I immediately thought of the Grapes of Wrath, particularly the film Mother Jode towards the end. They're driving in the truck here somewhere in Southern California, and she's saying, you know, women, they're like a river. They just flow on all the time, and men, they go fits and starts, and you don't ever quite get anywhere. So the way in which the idea of women flowing is even in this, you know, kind of very iconic film, and this, you know, obviously moment in time when there was also a water issue, maybe not in California, but in the Dust Bowl. It also made me think that when I teach any particular time period, I'm always so conscious of the selectiveness of what I'm talking about, that these are groups of artists or individuals that are working in the midst of a bigger kind of scenario. And you've referenced a few times, you know, some of the ways that other feminists might have pushed back. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the artists who did push back against the flow narrative and the kind of work that they were doing, or the way in which they attempted to create a conversation about flow and bodies, and the way in which those ideas might have bought into the stereotypes of women. And I'm thinking like that there would be two conversations, one in the 70s that you alluded to, a certain kind of puritanical, and then the more kind of theoretical position feminists in the 80s that might have pushed back against this. I'm just interested in the kind of conversations that might have been happening within the feminist community.
I did try to sort of narrate that, at least in outline. And I have to say, I'm not sure exactly where you want me to go in terms of the 80s is where you want me to go?
Well, it does. Either 80s or 70s. I mean, you have Carolee Schneemann, you've got Hannah Wilke producing this, you know, this very visceral work, even back, I suppose, into the 60s. But then you have other feminists you suggested who, I mean, you have the male art world who was responding in a particular way, but the resistance from the male art world might have been different from the way in which other feminists were calling into question the use of fluids and flows and
yeah, of course, and of course there are male art worlds. We've got to say that, right? There's not like the male art world.
Yeah.
I mean, feminists fight so much among themselves. Like we got to give men some space to, be divided too. I mean, you know, the women who came up through the 70s, 60s, and 70s. More so the women, the 60s work is more, it's more elliptical, right? And I think those women, although it was a more oppressive moment in terms of their not being able to own feminist speech, in a way it was liberating because nobody was going to tell them they were doing something feminist, right? Or call them on doing something feminist, and they certainly weren't going to kind of cop to it. So I'm sort of saying that they had a kind of golden moment there to kind of operate under cover. Then in the 70s we get this kind of more, programmatic, as I say, pedantic kind of moment. The 80s comes along and there's a swing. We might think about an artist like Barbara Kruger of the 80s, right? A very kind of theory-savvy artist. And they're kind of embarrassed by the 70s moment, and moreover they see, you know, this term essentialism becomes like, I mean, it's like the nastiest thing you can say to, you know, one woman to another. Oh, she's an essentialist, you know. And there's something to this, right? The idea that biology is destiny is what all these women were trying to get away from, right? But the idea that you can scrap biology altogether is problematic too. And that's sort of where I head towards. The women in the women in the 80s, a lot of them just thought we're just going to talk about constructions, and we're just going to talk about, we're going to turn to the commercial sphere, and we're going to turn to the sphere of the general culture and the way in which gender gets produced through advertising, for instance, or things like this. We're not going to talk about anything that is like elemental or inborn in gender. That's a regressive conversation to have. And that was an incredibly useful moment for feminism. It was a tough moment for women of the prior generation who were around to have to face these attacks on their work. But it was a very productive moment, and it was a moment when feminism sort of started getting more complicated in its theoretical strategies. But it was limited. The question of why you put all women together is always the question, and there's nothing in the catalog or anything, although she likes Jenny Sorkin, who I guess was involved with the catalog. She said, it's not like we get any explanation for what ties together women's sculptural practice in this period. So this is one kind of way of doing that, or at least doing one kind of narrative of saying there is a way to kind of talk about, as I call it, a sub rosa or cryptic kind of feminist strategy that you could see as tying these women together. It's a kind of a unified field theory of, although it doesn't cover the whole field by any means. So that's just another kind of way of explaining the project.
Thank you.
I mean, all of these women too, it bears saying, they were recognized in their day to an extent. Hesse's peers really thought incredibly highly of her, but it's not like she didn't get the gallery she wanted. It was the feminist critics who wanted to talk to her, and she just talked to them because they were the only critics who wanted to talk to her, really. But she was ambivalent about it at the same time. Although these women have incredible stature now, some of them do. I mean, Bourgeois has incredible stature, and she lived to be 100, which helps, right, or something like that. But Hesse died really young. That gives you another kind of cachet. I hate to say it, but this work is regarded as tremendously important now. But what I think it sometimes goes missing is the way in which these women were speaking to each other, and the idea that there's a kind of maybe a feminist tom-tom kind of going, that they would never, as I say, be public about, or even. But so it's a try, something like anything. Yeah.
How would you summarize the next generation of feminist art for the women that are working on these women's sculptures?
The next generation,
Like now.
Well, that's what I tried to do with Rist and with Mr. Rottenberg. But I wouldn't presume to try and summarize where this generation is. I think it's just such an interesting and complicated question, and that wasn't the project here for me. I brought on Rist and Rottenberg because I think both of them are, these projects are in a way in dialogue with the narrative that I was constructing, and I think they're quite wonderful in their way and maybe flawed in their ways. I've had some interesting conversations already with students this week about sort of how what a feminist artwork is nowadays. It's a complicated question to answer. I think it's an easier question to answer in terms of like real world politics than it is in terms of art politics. No, I wouldn't dare to try and summarize sort of where current generation is. That's a bound to get
my question is sort of related to Ali's question. In regards to that piece, the wrist piece for your body out, I was wondering, you described it as a soft menstruation during the piece. Do you think that generalized softness can sort of describe some of the feminist work currently, and even though you said it was resuming the 60s conversation of work, do you think that discounts the conversation, or do you think it pushes it forward?
I think it pushes it forward in a way, and I think she means it as a kind of salute to a prior generation of artists. I think she doesn't name names, but I don't think she'd deny it if you said, Bangladesh is a foremother for you here, or something like that. right? And she is, not all women are happy to call themselves feminists these days, but she is. But you're also trying to steer me into the trap she's trying to steer me into. And not going there. I mean, really, it's for you to tell me, quite honestly, right? Because this is, I was born in '53, so I wasn't like, I sort of was a 70s feminist. I was kind of on the cusp between 70s and 80s.
Thank you so much for your talk. And you kind of answered the question originally I had, which was the limits and potential of biology as a subject in the art, and the ways in which like now we're so happy to talk about bourgeois in terms of the sexuality in bourgeois, whereas before that was really absent. And this moment we're in now, where there's this revisiting of the 70s essentialism as a new kind of empowerment, just the way that art historians are looking at Joan Sennell, for instance, and Anita Steckel. Like they seem to be getting a lot of attention now, when I had no idea who they were until about 4 years ago, when Richard Meyer presented at the Feminist Art Project. I was like, wow, these are really interesting. And so there's,
So not all women got this kind of big, what do you call it, like this big boost that bourgeois got, right? There's some women who are still coming up. And it's great that they save their stuff, because it's expensive to save your stuff. But there have been a lot of women who've been waiting for this moment, and they're like in their 70s, and they were ready for these stores to open, and they're opening.